I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular webcast is one of a series on Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. Here I'll turn to the section of the essay in which she speculates what it would have been like, what would have been the conditions of possibility for a woman to write in Shakespeare's time. What if Shakespeare had had a sister? So then we get into this section that's most famous about Shakespeare's sister. So she's in the library, and she has just gone through a litany of these male writers describing why women couldn't write. Be that as it may, I could not help thinking, as I looked at the works of Shakespeare on the shelf, that the bishop was right, at least in this. It would have been impossible, completely and entirely, for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. Well, she says, Shakespeare himself went, very probably, to a grammar school where he may have learnt Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. Shakespeare was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer. Shakespeare famously was taken into court as a teenager for killing a deer that belonged to an aristocrat, and had rather sooner than he should have done to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. There's an old saying in the Ozarks where I grew up, common folk wisdom, that generally it takes 9 months after a sexual encounter for a child to be born. The term of a pregnancy is about 9 months, except for the first one. The first one can happen anytime. 2 months, 3 months, the first one is an exception. So Shakespeare had one of those. He got married, and pretty soon after they had their first child, one of those early ones. And his wife was a bit older than he was. That's also another matter. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. Woolf writes, he had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. Perhaps he began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theater, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, on the stage, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the Queen. Shakespeare's company acted before Queen Elizabeth. Special performances. So Shakespeare, it is imagined, led a charmed life, getting into trouble, then getting several second chances. But if he had a sister called Judith, perhaps, Judith's Shakespeare's life would have been much more narrowly constrained. Woolf writes, meanwhile, his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was, but she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about with books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. More likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. A parent can truly love a child and yet not act in one's best interest. Believing that one is acting in the best interest of one's child, but you can't know everything. You can't know the best situation for your child, and you can't always predict the future. You can't always imagine that the future your child will encounter will have the same conditions that you encountered when you were the child's age. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in the apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed to the son of a neighboring wool stapler. She cried out that marriage was hateful to her. Juliet, right? When her mother says, "It's time for you to be married," what does Juliet say? "It is an honor I had thought not on." She cried out that marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to hurt his feelings, not to shame him in this matter of marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or a fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. He was sincere. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? So then Woolf imagines Judith, the fictional imaginary sister of Shakespeare, running away to London. What if she did that? And note the invited comparison to what happened to Will in London. Parallel to her brother's experience. The force of her own gift alone drove her to it. She made up a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer's night, and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy, a gift like her brother's for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women acting. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted something. You can imagine what he would do with her, perhaps. The great irony here is the assumption that a teenage boy can play a woman on the stage, and it's natural and realistic and taken as self-evident. But a girl would seem preposterous. A girl acting the part of a woman or a girl? Who ever heard of such a thing? So that would be the case of Judith, that she goes on. She could get no training in her craft. Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? If she did, she would soon be taken for a prostitute. Yet her genius was for fiction and lusted to feed abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare the poet in her face, with the same gray eyes and rounded brows, at last, Nick Green, the actor-manager, took pity on her. She found herself with child by that gentleman, and so, who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught and tangled in a woman's body? She killed herself one winter's night and lies buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop, outside the Elephant and Castle. That, more or less, she says, is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had had Shakespeare's genius. But genius like Shakespeare's, surely women must have had. Genius is not solely the possession of rich white men. Genius like Shakespeare's is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people, it is said. It was not born among the Saxons and the Britons. It is not born today among the working classes, they say. But how then could it have been born among women whose work began almost before they were out of the nursery, who were forced to it by their parents and held to it by all the power of law and custom? Yet genius of a sort must have existed among women, as it must have existed among the working class. Now and again, an Emily Bronte or a Robbie Burns blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper in Shakespeare's day. When, however, One reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even of a very remarkable man who had a mother. Then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor, or mopped and mowed about the highways, crazed with the torture that her gift had put her to. There must have been women like that. They were simply suppressed by the conventions. And not just the conventions, by the material conditions, not just the attitudes, by the daily grind of constantly having to deal with the disrespect of someone like that beadle, or someone like that gentleman at the door of the library, of your own parents, your own peers, everyone constantly taking for granted that you're not meant for a life of note. For women, I thought, she writes, looking at the empty shelves, these difficulties were infinitely more formidable. Very few books were written by women in the library. In the first place, to have a room of her own, let alone a quiet room or a soundproof room, was out of the question for a woman at this time, unless her parents were exceptionally rich or very noble. Even up to the beginning of the 19th century, this would be the case, since her pin money, or her pocket money, or incidental money, which depended on the goodwill of her father, was only enough to keep her clothed. She was debarred from such alleviations as came even to Keats or Tennyson or Carlyle, all poor men, from a walking tour, a little journey to France, from the separate lodging which, even if it were miserable enough, sheltered them from the claims and tyrannies of their families. These men could have a little life of their own, even if they didn't have a fancy apartment, a fancy lodging. They had independence, the material conditions and means of independence, even if they were poor, and some of the writers were. Such material difficulties were formidable, but much worse than the material difficulties faced by women were the immaterial difficulties. On that point, I'll pause for now and save my concluding remarks on Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own for a subsequent webcast, the fourth in this series. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.